Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to today's webinar, Stress, What It Is and What to Do About It, with our guest speaker, Jayson Moran. Just before we get started then today, I just want to bring you to draw your attention to joining DLR West Business Association. It's a new business association set up to represent businesses in Nutgrove, Churchtown and Ballantyre. So it's going to be great focus on marketing the area, marketing your business, creating networking events for cross-utilization of services and keeping businesses within the local community, advice, our second Tuesday events, along with our webinars in conjunction with Bridge Enterprise Centres, the one we're on today, as well as advocating then with council and government bodies for any, key decision making and planning issues. So if you scan that QR code, it'll bring you directly to our website, where you can find out further details and sign up digitally, or you can go to our website directly, www.dlrwba.ie, and you can find further information there. For today's session then, we'll be copying in links and polls and that into our chat function and our Q&A, and if anybody has any questions that they have for Jayson, just pop them into the Q&A or chat function and we'll answer them at the end. Over to you, Jayson. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Kieran. And I suppose, I'd really like to just start today to say thanks to Kieran and Lauren in the Bridge Enterprise. They've been super supportive over the last couple of weeks to get this up and running and promoting it and everything. So thanks a million, Kieran. Much appreciated. So my name is Jayson Moran. I'll introduce myself properly in a minute. But just in terms of that little bit of housekeeping before we begin, as Kieran was saying, we're going to use the chat box function just in terms of communication because it's a recorded webinar. But if you have any questions that you're not comfortable putting into the chat box, because sometimes stress can be a bit of a sensitive topic, feel free to direct message me and I will do my best to address them over the course of the talk. And we'll do a little bit of a Q&A depending on how we're doing for time at the end as well. So can I ask, just in terms of the chat function, I just want to make sure everyone's got access to it and everyone's comfortable with it, and so I can see it on my side as well. Could people just let me know in the chat, how are you doing today? How's your week going? How are you feeling? Or even just to stick in where you're dialing in from. That'd be great. Just let me know in the chat, how are you doing today, please? Okay, so we've got one person from Bray, I can see. I was just talking to Kieran before this, and you'll see as well. And I asked Kieran how he was doing today. He was having a very stressful morning. We're talking a lot about stress and bits and pieces. With he had a bit of a flat tire on the way in, so I'm sure as bad as today is going, I'm sure it hasn't been as eventful as seems. Okay, so we one person calling in from Bray. Very good. Okay. So just to introduce myself properly, my name is Jayson Moran. I am a psychologist and my background is in the psychology of performance development and well-being. So I'm very interested in things like stress, confidence, critical thinking and how we think and problem solve, relationships, and in particular positive working relationships, and how groups problem solve and how teams work together, and also organizational culture is one of the things I'm very interested in. The picture there on the screen is of me and my wonderful partner, Sonia. So Sonia is Italian, and she actually went back to study biochemistry in Trinity College as a mature student. And the reason I have that picture of us up there is one of the things we're both into very much is personal and professional development as well. So I actually went back to college as a mature student to study psychology in Trinity when I was 30, and I did a master's in UCC in positive psychology and coaching psychology in University College Cork. So in terms of my businesses, I have two. So the first is Jayson Moran Psychology and Coaching, and I'm doing that about 7 years. And for that, it's one-to-one coaching for entrepreneurs and professionals. The tagline is we help get you unstuck, unstressed, clear and connected. And my new venture is Insight First, and that is performance development and culture for more established and larger organizations. And I set that up, I suppose, in order to focus on slightly bigger companies. So we do leadership development coaching, we do team development and group facilitation, and we also do leadership and professional development programs. I think Kieran has some links he'll stick in the chat there just in relation to all of those if you do want to reach out or get in touch or have a look at any of the websites or anything.
Yeah, they're in the Q&A, Jayson, there. So
thanks a million. Yeah. Cheers, Kieran. So I wanted to start off a little bit, just in terms of not me just rabbiting on about stress, but I'd like to hear a little bit about you and your stress. And so in order to do that, I said we would use a function called Slido. And Slido is good because it allows us to survey people anonymously. Because sometimes when we're talking about stress, it can be a little bit sensitive and people mightn't want to talk about it. So I thought that this might be a way of being able to ask you a few questions without putting you under pressure in a chat. So what I'd like you to do, you can either click the link in the chat or you can scan the QR code on the screen. And I have a couple of questions around what's the kind of things that are stressing you out? How does your stress tend to express itself in terms of its symptoms and what kind of strategies you use? So let's just click that on. So the first question I would like to ask you is, what are the kind of things that are stressing you out at the moment? So we were doing a little test earlier, and that's where the story with Kieran's flat tire came up from this morning. But let me know in the Slido, what are the kind of things that are stressing you out? So stressors, it turns out, they fall into two broad categories. So you can think about, we've got stressors in our personal lives and we've got stressors in our work life. In our personal lives, these can be things like our physical health, our finances, our home situation. I think with the housing crisis, there's a lot of stress around that at the minute. Or it can be even in your neighborhood. If you don't feel safe walking around in your neighborhood or going outside your front door, that can be very, very stressful as well. We can have stresses in our personal relationships, whether that's with your partner, or with your family, or with your friends. And also, our children can be a major source of stress. So, for example, I have a very good friend at the minute, and she's got a very sick kid, and there isn't too many things more stressful than that. In our work lives, though, our stressors tend to fall into six very distinct categories. So the first is a lack of sense of control. So we don't have control over our time, we don't have control over our resources, or we don't have control over the things that happen to us in work. A second major stressor in work relates to workload. So that's the amount of things we have to do, but also the variety of things we have to do. Because sometimes if we've got too many different things to be doing and we're trying to juggle too many balls, that in itself can be super, super stressful because we've got to change, I suppose, how we're thinking about things very, very quickly. The third major stressor we have in work has got to do with reward. So sometimes that reward is financial, but often, I suppose, the sense of reward or not having a sense of reward in work is related to a lack of recognition. We're not getting that pat in the back when we do a good job, or maybe we're not even being rewarded financially for, I suppose, the input that we maybe put in a business or in a job. Another thing that can really stress you out in work is a sense of fairness. So if you don't feel the decisions relating to you are fair, that can often lead to an awful lot of stress. So maybe you feel you should have got that promotion, or maybe you feel you should be getting more money as well. Two other things tend to stress us out in work as well. That is a lack of community or a lack of connection with the people we work with or with our employer. So sometimes work can feel very transactional, and we're social beings. And so if you don't have that sense of connection in work, it can be very, very stressful as well. The last piece then is around values. So if you're working somewhere and I suppose the company's got different values than you, that believes different things are important, then that can be very, very stressful as well, and can sometimes put us in ethical situations where we feel, we should be acting in one way, but the company feels we should be acting in another. Okay, so I'll have a look at the Slido now. So in terms of what's stressing you guys out at the minute, work relationships seems to be a big one, and life and work balance can be always tricky. There's never enough time, in my experience with these things. People being busy, house bills, so that's, I suppose, back to that financial thing in terms of work, cash flow. Yeah, that can be serious, and whether that's personal or professional, that can be an issue. Financials as well. And I'm going to talk a lot today about, so in terms of the work-life balance thing, I'm going to talk a lot about the concept of downtime. Hopefully, you'll find that useful. And in terms of the cash flow and the financial thing, a lot of that can be, I suppose, how we're perceiving situation. A lot of stress is down to the sensation that we haven't got enough resources in order to deal with the problems we have in front of us. Okay, so a lot of what's there will be very much in line with what we're talking about today. Very good. Okay. The second question I have for you is, how do you know when you're stressed? What are your symptoms? What are the red flags that jump up for you where you go, oh, hang on, maybe I need to have a look at this, or maybe I am a little bit stressed out? I've got a couple that kind of jump up for me a lot. One is I tend to worry at night. I've trouble getting to sleep, or I'll wake up shortly after I've fallen asleep and thoughts are racing through my mind. Another symptom I always have in terms of stress is muscle tension. I tend to hold a lot of my stress in my body. So I often find if my neck or my shoulders or my back is getting tight, that's a sign that I'm stressed. And another one I often get is mouth ulcers when I'm chronically stressed. So when it gets really bad with me, I tend to suffer from mouth ulcers, which is very strange. And I'll explain where all those things come from in a couple of minutes. Okay, so we someone in the chat says their brain is fried, waking up at 4 a.m. and thinking about issues. Yeah, so that constant worry, I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while and maybe some strategies to help deal with that and hopefully getting back to sleep actually. Frustration, yeah, that is a super common symptom of when we are stressed. And that's because stress is a very, very emotional thing. And that frustration then, whether it's frustration with ourselves, I'd be interested to hear that, or is it frustration with other people, or just frustration with the situation? And an awful lot of that is because we don't feel good in ourselves because of what's going on. Restless sleep, again, very, very common, and poor sleep there again from someone else. So, okay, so a lot of physiological symptoms there as well. And eating habits disimprove. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit as well. That's called a negative coping strategy. And that's all about helping us, I suppose, deal with how we feel around stress. Another one is becoming sick, and I can hold my hand up there. I had awful issues in my 20s with my health, and it seemed a lot of it seemed to be stress related. And also, someone else is irritable and taking it out on others. And that makes a lot of sense. And I'll talk a good bit about that as well. Okay. The final question I have for you here in the Slido is, what kind of strategies do you guys use when you're stressed? How do you address your stress, so to speak? I have a couple of go-tos, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about these. I've got a 35-minute yoga video that I watch, and that seems to be the magic key for me. And that gets me nice and relaxed. And funnily enough, we'll talk about how that happens in a while, but when you relax your body, it can really do an awful lot to relax your mind. Um, Someone says that's why I'm here. Okay, well, hopefully we can give you a couple of practical strategies. And even as I said, I'll leave contact details there as well. I'm more than happy to have a quick chat with people around in terms of their individual stuff afterwards as well. Someone else says go for a walk. And exercise is probably one of the best things you can be doing for your stress. Absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit more about specifically what kind of exercise you need to be doing. Someone else takes the time to think it out. And I'd love to hear how you take the time to think it out. Do you have any particular strategies or any things you use? Meditation. I'll talk a little bit about mindfulness-based stress reduction today. Meditation is absolutely brilliant. I've got a free course online that I'd love to share with people. It's not my own course, it's from someone else online, a retired American clinical psychologist. It's a mindfulness-based stress reduction meditation course, and it's amazing. Go to the gym and listen to music. So exercise again, and more exercise. Debrief a colleague or boss, an angry vent, getting it out of your head and off your chest. Very, very, very important in terms of our experience of stress. And breathing exercises as well. Okay, lovely. So you'll notice that there's a lot of those are distraction as well from your stress. Very good. Okay, so the reason I ask those three questions is normally when I'm working with people on stress. There are kind of the three first things I'm very interested in. So when you're dealing with stress, first off, it's very important to define what exactly is stressing you out. Then it's very important to define your symptoms, because often when we're treating or working with stress, it's not about treating stress more generally. You're actually working on minimizing and reducing your symptoms. And so it's very important to know what they are. And that can help you choose a strategy that's going to work for you. And then what I always do is I encourage people to experiment with different things. And the reason being, often with stress, you don't really know it's going to work until you hit on those couple of sweet 2 or 3 really good strategies. And the reason for that is different strategies are going to work for different people at different times and in different contexts, depending on what they've got going on. I'll jump on to some more of those stress symptoms as well. And the reason I tend to focus on these is often sometimes we're stressed and we don't realize that we're stressed. We don't realize how stressed we are. So stress symptoms tend to come in 4 types. The first are physiological. So the first is muscle tension, which is something I'm guilty of suffering quite a lot. And very much associated with that are stress headaches. And stress headaches actually occur because of muscle tension. It's because of muscle tension in the back of your neck and the muscles around the side of your head and face. And that's actually what causes it, as opposed to anything inside your head. The other physiological symptom are sexual problems, and that's because stress is a very hormonal thing. And when your stress hormones and cortisol and stuff get messed up, that can impact other functioning in your body. And that's pretty much the same reason why we often get digestive issues when we're stressed out. So often people suffer from stomach issues, ulcers, dry mouth, irritable bowel syndrome, all those things. They're very much associated with stress and stress symptoms. And finally, sweating. If you find yourself sweating in the middle of the day when you're not exercising or not working out, that can often be a sign that you're chronically stressed. Psychological symptoms include, and these come up in the Slido as well, racing thoughts, things going over and over in your mind, where you're kind of very distracted by your stresses and your worries, things going over and over and over and over in your mind. Constant worry as well, but not only do we worry, we often tend to catastrophize. So not only are we worried about things going badly, things are going to go terribly, and they're going to have catastrophic consequences. Because of all this worry, often a good indication that you're stressed as well is when you become more forgetful and you're forgetting things and missing things and having difficulty concentrating, because we can get very distracted when we're chronically stressed. It impacts cognitively how we function. And because we don't feel particularly good when we're stressed, that can often lead to emotional symptoms as well. So we get more irritable. Again, as someone said on the slide, we get more anxious. And often because we're feeling irritable and anxious, we can not feel so good about ourselves, and that can impact our self-esteem. Because our self-esteem is down generally, we're not feeling good about ourselves, our mood can generally get lower. And then on top of that, because we're feeling so rotten, often the last thing we want to do is to have to deal with other people. So we can feel very unsociable when we are stressed. And finally, stress symptoms are also behavioral. Our tempers are a bit shorter, we're more unreasonable, we tend to argue more, we're not as good socially when we're chronically stressed. Also, someone else had said we tend to have more unhealthy behaviors. So we drink more, we smoke more, we scroll on our phone more, most definitely when we are chronically stressed. So these are things to look out for. If you're doing more of those things than you normally would, might give you an indication that stress is something you need to have a look at. Two other behavioral symptoms, we tend to talk faster, and that can be a good one to keep an eye out in for other people or people around you. So you'll often notice when people are nervous when they're public speaking, they'll speak really, really quickly. And it's almost like they're trying to talk their way through or out of the problem. And also, we tend to get more clumsy when we're stressed, and that's very much associated with those difficulties in concentrating as well. So just things to keep an eye out for. And I say this because sometimes we don't realize when we're stressed. And again, myself included from my own experience. So, final question. We'll just stick this into the chat box rather than doing a Slido. I'm curious, what do you think stress actually is? What are we talking about it? Or what are we talking about? And the reason I ask that question is if you want to have a strategy to deal with something, it's very important to know what it is that you're dealing with. So let me know in the chat, what do you think stress actually is? It's one of those words that I suppose we use it so often. I don't necessarily actually think about what exactly is stress. Any thoughts in the chat? I'll take the silence as people are a bit stumped. The reason I asked that question is that stress is actually being thought of from lots of different ways and lots of different angles. Even in just the field of psychology alone, there is numerous ideas, numerous concepts, and numerous ways of thinking about it. So I'm going to define that stress is not one thing today. I'm going to put forward that stress is actually three different things. That stress is physiological, that stress is psychological and emotional, and that stress is also very much associated with our problems. So I'm going to talk about three definitions of stress and strategies that will be associated depending on if that's the definition that we want to focus on. So the first definition is that stress is a biological response to a stressor. It's physiological. The second definition is that stress is when we perceive or when we see the demand of a situation as exceeding our ability to cope with that situation. And the third definition is stress is very much associated with our problems. Stress is what arises when something we care about or something that is important is at stake. Okay. So let's have a look at the first of those. So the first, stress is a biological response to a stressor. And what we're talking about here is what's called the biological stress response. And so what happens is this. So imagine you've got maybe something stressful coming up. Maybe you've got an exam coming up. Particular parts of your brain, the hypothalamus, which kind of controls your bodily function, sends a message to another part of your brain called the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland releases hormones, and those hormones send a message to your kidneys. And they send a message to a very specific part of your kidneys, madly enough. I was always very surprised when I heard stress was associated with your kidneys. It sends a message to what's called the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands in turn release what are called stress hormones out into the wider body, and this leads to lots of changes in your body. And the adrenal glands actually release two types of hormones that cause two different types of stress. And the first kind of stress is called acute stress, and this is quick, and this is very much what's associated with what's called the fight or flight response. And so with the acute response, it's releasing adrenaline. You've probably heard of adrenaline, and adrenaline does some very interesting things to your body. It increases heart rate and flow. It opens up your lungs. It gets your liver to release glucose into your bloodstream. And why it's doing all this is it's getting your body ready to fight or flight. It's trying to put energy into your extremities in your system. So you can often think of the acute stress response as someone, or as you putting the foot on the gas, releasing fuel into the system in order that you can deal with whatever the problem is. The second type of stress response is what's called the chronic stress response, though, and your adrenal glands release a very different hormone, and this is a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol works in a much slower way and over a longer period of time than adrenaline. And so it's kind of what it's doing is it's giving that fight or flight response, but over a longer period of time. And so it does things then rather than raising your heart rate, it raises your blood pressure in order that, I suppose, your body is ready to send all these nutrients and this oxygen and energy around the edges of your body. It also raises your glucose blood levels so that you've got that energy and that sugar there ready to kind of be used more quickly when you're ready. And it also shuts down non-essential or non-immediate systems in your body. So it shuts down things like your digestive system and your immune system, because if you're having to deal with, an immediate threat like a predator or whatever it was, then you don't really need to worry about your immune system right now. And this is why, and cortisol is part of the reason why stress is very much associated with negative health outcomes. I'm just going to have a look. There's a question there in the chat. How do you differentiate between chronic stress systems here and anxiety? I'll come back to that a little bit later because it's a bit of an in-depth question, if that's okay. And there definitely is ways. So stress and cortisol and this chronic stress response, how does it harm our health? Well, two major, I suppose, aspects of our health that cortisol and stress tend to impact. So the first is our physical health. So because our blood pressure is raised, it's very much associated with things like arteriosclerosis and chronic heart disease. So what happens is because our blood pressure is increased, our arteries thicken to deal with that extra pressure. And because the arteries thicken, they're more likely to get clogged. And that's why stress is associated with chronic heart disease and heart attacks. The raise in blood sugar is associated with higher levels of diabetes and more stressed people. And because cortisol cuts and shuts down our immune system, it messes with that whole balancing system. And so it's associated with lots of autoimmune issues. And similarly with digestive issues that people have, it's because these systems are constantly being turned on and off. It impacts their normal functioning. In terms of your mental health, it's actually a very interesting mechanism in terms of how being chronically stressed tends to lead to things like anxiety and depression and also burnout as well. So I suppose when we're dealing with normal levels of stress, what happens is your body releases this hormone cortisol, the stressful situation ends, and then you've got enzymes in your blood, and these enzymes actually break down the cortisol and reabsorb it into your system, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. But if you're chronically stressed and you're constantly releasing lots and lots of cortisol, what happens is it builds up in your bloodstream and these enzymes become overwhelmed and they stop being able to absorb the cortisol. And so more cortisol builds up, but it turns out cortisol is actually damaging to some of the neurons in your brain and other systems in your body. And what happens is the parts of your brain that regulate and measure cortisol are the first things to get damaged. And so then it keeps making more and more and more cortisol, and you get a positive feedback loop. And eventually that starts to alter certain regions of your brain, and that tends to lead to the anxiety and depression. So this buildup of cortisol over time can be just very, very harmful to both your physical and your mental health. So what can we do about it? So in terms of reducing cortisol, there's two main strategies. The first is exercise, and it's great to see so many people saying that their go-to in terms of dealing with stress is exercise. So exercise tends to work by releasing endorphins. So these are feel-good hormones. And so really, I suppose the idea with this is because when you feel positive emotions, it tends to negate the negative effect of negative emotions. And so I suppose the more that we feel good, we can kind of deal with our stresses and those aspects of things. The second thing exercise is really good at is releasing muscle tension. And when you release muscle tension, what that tends to do is it tends to relax your body. And when you can relax your body, that can really help in terms of relaxing your mind. Exercise, if you're not doing it regularly already and you want to use it in terms of your stress, just a couple of points. First off, you want to start slow and get medical advice if you haven't been exercising in a long period of time. And the reason I say that is the kind of exercise you want to be doing is you want to be doing light cardio of some description. So what you're trying to do is get your body into your target heart rate for 20 to 30 minutes per day. And your target heart rate for stress should be between 60 and 80% of your maximum heart rate. So a lot of Apple Watches and stuff like that will give you easy ways to figure that out. But the key with exercise is to do it regularly. You need to be doing it 3 to 5 times a week, because if you're only doing it once a week, it'll actually probably end up being more stressful than stress reduction because your body's not used to it. It won't adapt. And the other really interesting thing about exercise and stress is exercise only works if we want to do it. So if we're being forced to exercise, or we feel that we're being forced to exercise rather than this is something that we want to do for good reasons, it can actually be more stressful in itself as well, which I thought was very, very interesting. The second type of physiological strategy are what are called relaxation techniques. So relaxation techniques, what you're trying to create is what's called a relaxation response. And this is, I suppose, like the stress response's good twin. So it's all about slowing your heart rate down, slowing your breathing down. And really what you're doing is you're trying to get your muscles in your body to relax and relax deeply. And funnily, what this does is it sends a message to the vein or to the brain through a nerve called the vagus nerve. So it's kind of sending a subconscious message to your brain that everything is okay. And so this tends to impact things like how we think. So we actually think much less analytically when we are very relaxed. We tend to, I suppose, come out of problem solving mode, and this can kind of turn on a very positive feedback loop in terms of how you're problem solving as well. I'll talk about that in a minute. So really what you're trying to do with this is overall you want to reduce those cortisol levels over time. There's lots of deep relaxation techniques out there. It's not just about sitting on the couch and chilling out, although that can be like perfectly good as well. But really, you want to be doing something like maybe 20 to 30 minutes of like very relaxing yoga or breathing techniques. Progressive muscle relaxation is a really good one, or mindfulness-based meditation can be very good as well. So the key with this is to find one or two things that you enjoy doing in terms of deeply relaxing. And because you want to be trying to do this regularly. If you find yourself chronically stressed, I usually recommend with people that they're trying to get in 30 minutes a day of some form of deep relaxation, and whatever it is that works for you. One of my clients has actually just started going to sauna every 2 or 3 days for 30 minutes, and she finds that like amazingly relaxing. The last thing in terms of relaxation to really consider is your level of downtime. So downtime is not sleep. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is three things, the 3 R's of downtime. So you've got rest, relaxation, or relationships. So you're spending time in relationships in a positive way where you're relaxed and you're enjoying it. And these are American numbers, and I would say I would probably recommend if you can to do a little bit more than this, but you want to be doing at least 1 hour a day. That's 1 day a week, and 1 week every 12 in terms of actual rest, recreation, or relationships. That's chill out time. And that's all about, again, you're just trying to negate that cortisol build up by making sure you relax for a little period every day. The really interesting thing, and why I focus on physiological strategies first to people, is because our physical state really impacts our ability to think and to problem solve, which will be very much related to the other two types of strategies that I talk about. So I'll give you an example. When I said it earlier, I went back to college as a mature student, and I got into study psychology in Trinity College, and I went through an access program, etc. But I found myself in the class with some of the smartest kids in the country, and I was a bit intimidated by it and went, do you know what I'll do? I'll outwork them. And so I worked very, very hard over a period of 2 years. And I got to the end of my second year and I had one paper to put in. I was very stressed at the time and I was trying to get everything done. And I had a huge amount of time and about a week to do this. And I couldn't think about what to write the essay on. And so days went by, and I was so stressed and so tense, I just couldn't think about what to write it on. So eventually I did a deep relaxation technique called progressive muscle relaxation because I read about this. And it's basically what you do is you tense every muscle group in your body as tight as you can, and then you consciously relax. And you do that in sequence. And it's a very deeply relaxing experience. And eventually, I remember the muscles in my back kind of cracked and relaxed, and I finally deeply relaxed. And 10 minutes later, the answer came to me. I ended up writing the essay on stress. I suppose the answer was staring me in the face the whole time. And the point I'm trying to get across with that is how you feel is really going to impact how you think. And we often try to think our way out of our problems rather than focusing on how we feel first, and that can impact how well we think. Okay, so that's physiological strategies. The next type of strategy I want to talk about are more psychological and emotional. So when we're talking about this, rather than just a physiological stress response, I want to talk about what's called a psychological stress response. So the psychological stress response works a little bit like this. So imagine you have that upcoming exam, you have that stressor. What you do psychologically is you ask yourself two questions. Question one is this stressful? Is this something I need to worry about? And question two is, can I cope? So for question one, with that upcoming exam, maybe it's not stressful. Maybe you've prepared for the exam or you don't need the grade. But if it is, if it is an important exam or you're not prepared yet, then maybe the answer is yes, this is stressful. And so then we move on to question two. And so question two, can I cope, refers to, do I have the resources to deal with the problem? So in the exam example, maybe, have you got some time to study, or have you got friends that you can ask for help in terms of how to approach the exam? And if you have those resources, if you do feel you've got the resources to cope, what this tends to do is it tends to lead to direct action. We tend to deal with the problem, So for example, you sit down and study, or you go and you meet your friends and you ask, how do we go about dealing with this exam? But if the answer to can I cope is no, i.e., I don't have people I can ask, or I don't have the time, what we do is we tend to develop what are called coping mechanisms. And all a coping mechanism is, it's an indirect way of dealing with a stressor. And the idea with this is what we're trying to do is remove some of the feeling of feeling stressed. And coping strategies themselves, there's two types. So we've got what are called negative coping strategies and positive coping strategies. So negative coping strategies are some of the behavioral symptoms I was talking about earlier, like things like we drink more, we smoke more, people tend to use more illicit drugs, scrolling on your phone is probably the classic at the minute. And the problem with these negative coping strategies is we tend to avoid the problem, and can even make the problem worse in the long run as a result. Positive coping strategies on the other side, the idea with these are going to impact how you feel, and they'll also build your capacity in order to deal with problems. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. So the psychological stress response, simply, it's an idea or a narrative in our head that we don't have the resources, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough social support, we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough clarity, we don't have enough motivation. And so two main strategies in order to deal with that. The first is called reframing, and the second are called emotional coping strategies, and I'll dive into them now. So reframing, I suppose thinking about our thinking is really important, because sometimes we suffer from what are called unhelpful thinking patterns, and in particular when we're looking at our problems and deciding, are they stressful? So some of the kind of unhelpful thinking patterns or unrealistic thinking patterns we all suffer from, and a lot of the time, include all or nothing thinking. So this is also called binary thinking or black and white thinking. There's no nuance, there's no gray. Either things are this way or that way. Maybe the most common example of that is perfectionism. It's where we think, you know what, if it's not perfect, then I failed, or even worse, if it's not perfect, then I'm a failure. The second type of unhelpful thinking pattern, often associated with stress, is what we call emotional reasoning. And this is assuming because we feel a certain way, what we're thinking must be true. The classic with this is, I feel embarrassed, so I must be an idiot. But another common one is, I'm anxious about this or I'm stressed about this, so I must be right in thinking that I can't cope with it, and so I'm going to fail. Third unhelpful thinking pattern we often do is what's called jumping to conclusions. Jumping to conclusions have two types. We tend to think that we can predict the future and we know exactly what's going to happen. And that future is usually got a negative hinge to it. And the second conclusion we tend to jump to is we think we can mind read. We know what other people are thinking. And again, it's usually not positive when we're in a stressed out situation. So the common one there might be something like, oh, if we're even thinking about that exam, is I'm going to fail, and it's not that, it's actually going to be the end of my career. And this is called catastrophizing. So not only do we jump to conclusions, we kind of blow it up out of proportion as well. So what do we do about unhelpful thinking patterns? Well, the challenge with these is it's very difficult, even if you can catch yourself doing these things, it's very difficult just to tell yourself what to think. And the reason being is we often don't believe it. So, for example, if you're struggling with confidence about something, staring in the mirror and going, I'm confident, I'm confident, I'm confident, despite what some people say, it doesn't work for the simple reason we don't really believe ourselves. So we need strategies in place in order to challenge our thinking. The process I normally do with people is it's all about identifying the patterns and then challenging them. So I would use what's called the cognitive behavioral model. You might have heard of it in terms of therapy. I'm a coach, so I use cognitive behavioral coaching. And that's all about identifying the patterns between your thoughts or your story or the narrative you're telling yourself, about other people, or about the situation you're in, and your emotional reaction and your behavioral reaction, and how those things interact with each other in interesting ways. So, we're looking at trying to figure out what are your assumptions, what are the rules, or what are the attitudes you have towards things, and are they helping you or are they hindering you? And the interesting thing about that is, often these rules or attitudes or assumptions, we're not necessarily conscious of them when we're walking around in our day to day. So really, we're looking at identifying the patterns. In terms of challenging your underlying beliefs around your stress, a really good method is what's called Socratic question. So if you give this a Google, you'll come up with a list of Socratic questions, and they're all about challenging and looking at, how useful is our thinking and how realistic is it? So you might ask yourself questions like, what's the evidence for this belief or this assumption, and what's the evidence against it? And that's a really good question because, especially when I suppose we very rarely try to prove ourselves wrong, So even if we're criticizing ourselves around something, how often do you stop yourself and try and prove yourself wrong? It's just something we don't naturally do, but it can really help in terms of getting a bit more balance in terms of how we're thinking. Another really good question to ask yourself when you're stressed out about something is, will it matter in 10 days? Will it matter in 10 weeks? Or will it matter in 10 months? And why that's a really good question is it can give you a bit of perspective and a little bit of psychological and emotional distance, because often we're so caught up in the moment, we miss the bigger picture. And a final Socratic question, this is probably my favorite when people are stressed out, or especially when they're criticizing themselves, is what advice would you give to a friend who was in the same situation? Or what advice would you give to a friend who was talking to themselves like that about their problems? And that's a really good question because we tend to be a bit kinder and we tend to be a bit more rational when we're giving advice to others than when we're talking about ourselves or to ourselves. So that's the cognitive behavioral kind of techniques in that. The second aspect of the psychological response is that question, okay, it's stressful, but can I cope? So two aspects to this. The first is self-belief. So all your self-belief is really it's your ability to handle situations and your belief in your ability to solve problems. And if you're struggling a little bit with self-belief, what can be a really good thing to reflect on is how have you dealt with similar problems or similar stresses in the past? What did you do then? What actions did you take? How did you act, or how did you deal with it? And that can really be helpful. A second thing in terms of your self-belief that can be very helpful is taking those big, vague problems and breaking it down into smaller, manageable chunks. And rather than trying to, I suppose, face everything at once, it's about, you know, what's the next thing that we need to deal with in front of. And I suppose taking a small bite out of a problem and getting a little bit of progress can really, really help in terms of your self-belief. The second aspect of that question, can I cope, is, well, what kind of coping strategies have you got in place? And these fall into kind of two main categories. The first is support. So what kind of social and or professional support are you getting? If you do find yourself chronically stressed, are you talking to your friends and your family about it and what's stressing you out? And just talking about things can be so helpful. But again, this is very much with the emotional coping strategies I'm going to talk about. Talking about things gets problems out of your head and off your chest and kind of out there. Um, Sometimes, depending on what's going on in your personal or professional life, you don't have that kind of proper support. So finding a good therapist or a good coach to tease out your problems and work with can be very, very helpful as well. And there's lots of resources out there at the minute. Even like there is lots of, even if the financial implications of working with a therapist, for example, there is lots of free supports out there. You'd be amazing. If you do a little bit of a Google, you'll find some very cool stuff. The second type of coping strategy are what we call emotional coping strategies. So emotional coping strategies are all about, I suppose, changing how we're dealing with how we feel. There's two I really recommend. The first is mindfulness-based stress reduction. So you'll see courses like this advertised in Dublin for mindfulness-based stress reduction. This is very evidence-based, based on the work of John Kabat-Zinn. And they're great. They're a little bit expensive to do in person, but there is a free online mindfulness-based stress reduction course by a retired clinical psychologist in America called Palouse Mindfulness. That's Palouse mindfulness. And if you give that a Google, it's a free online evidence-based course. It's amazing. I think it would be about €800 to do in person in Dublin. If you really want to put in a bit of time in terms of working on your stress, I couldn't recommend anything better, and it's free. Another free strategy is what we call expressive writing. And again, if you give this a Google, you'll get pretty simple instructions on how to do it. But really, with expressive writing, all you're doing is you're taking a pen and a piece of paper, you're locking yourself away for 20 minutes, and you're just writing about whatever it is that's stressing you out. And again, very evidence-based, there's a lot of research done on this. Really what you're doing is, because you're writing about your problem consistently for 20 minutes, don't worry about grammar, don't worry about structure, just write about it. You're getting it out of your head and off your chest and onto a piece of paper. And that in itself tends to be very, very helpful. Okay, so we've looked at stress as something that's physiological and stress as something that's psychological. I want to look at the more practical element of things now. When we think about stress, is actually very much associated with our problems. And we think about stress this way, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and you'll see what I mean by that, because stress is something that arises when something we care about is at stake. And that definition comes from a book called The Upside of Stress by a lady called Kelly McGonigal. And in that book, she talks about two stress mindsets. And so the first is we have the mindset that stress is harmful. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I suppose I'm talking about a lot of the negative impacts physiologically that stress has on us. But when we have this stress is harmful mindset, sometimes it can lead to worse outcomes. And the reason being we get stressed about our stressed, or get stressed about our stress even. And so this means that we can kind of get distracted by our stress and not deal with our problems. And often this is when we start to use negative coping strategies. We feel we can't cope, and so we do these negative behaviors in order to deal with our stress, in order to make ourselves feel a bit better. But often what that means is we end up avoiding our problems. And in the long run, this tends to create more stress. So the second mindset McGonigal talks about is that we can have a mindset that stress actually enhances us. And when we think about our stress like this, that it's there for a reason, maybe it's given us a bit of a message, we tend to have better outcomes. And the reason being is when we don't see stress as such a bad thing, we see it as a message we need to do something, we tend to deal with our issues. And this in turn helps us build resources and build skills. So, if you're dealing with your problems, you tend to get better at dealing with your problems. And overall, over time, this tends to lead to a lot less stress. But how on earth can stress be beneficial? Well, it turns out when we're stressed, when we focus on certain things, it actually can release some beneficial and good hormones in our body. So, for example, if some people will chase stress. So, if you ever heard of like skydivers, for example, will jump from a plane, which, if you want to look at it objectively, I think it would be a very stressful experience. But because they're chasing that rush, because they're chasing that stress, they're doing their best to enjoy it, they actually release a hormone called DHEA, and that really helps them focus and really zone in on the on the experience. A second hormone we experience when we're stressed is oxytocin, and we tend to create oxytocin when we focus on other people in stressful situations. So this is called the tend and befriend response. So you'll often find, especially in tragic situations, that people can really step up and be better to other people. And this is actually very much associated with the stress response. The third type of positive response we have from stress is actually we learn a little bit better, and this is because of increased brain plasticity. And often when people are training professionals to deal with stressful situations, so like firefighters or the Navy SEALs, what they'll do is they'll purposely stress them out when they're training them. They'll put them in stressful situations. And that's so that they can learn to deal with stressful situations. So when you're in stressful situations, always remember that there is things that you can learn from it. And even just a little bit of a tweak can be very beneficial. Okay, so how might your stress mindset impact your ability to problem solve or to solve some of your problems? Well, um, what I want you to do for a second, I want you to imagine a situation for me. I want you to imagine that you're sat in a room and you've been told you're about to sit an exam. This is a very difficult exam, and about actually 85% of people tend to fail that exam. And it tends to be people who've done course X who tend to do okay in the exam. Now, not only have you not done course X, you don't even know what course X is. And then they tell you as they're handing out the exam papers, and at the end of this, what we want to do is we're going to interview the 5 worst performers. We're going to get them to walk up because we want to find out what they're doing so wrong. So I want to imagine how you'd feel if you were sitting down in that exam hall. And so this is what 2 Croatian psychologists, Draksavahi and Iraz, did in 2002. And what they were doing is they were setting up the situation so it felt like a threat situation. And we tend to perceive situations as a threat when the situation is going to lead to failure. So, i.e., 85% of people fail in this instance, and we don't have any strategies to cope. I.e., people wouldn't have done the course, and there's going to be some form of punishment. Now, these 2 psychologists also set up another room with about the same amount, 30, 35 people. They gave them the same exam, but they framed it a little bit different. So when they were handing out the exam in the second instance, they actually went, okay, guys, so about 15% of people perceive or succeed with this. Generally, people who do well are the people who persist with the problems, and we want to interview the best performers at the end of this exam. And so what they were doing in this instance is they were giving them the exact same paper, but they were framing it as a challenge this time. And the reason that that's important is, or I suppose, like how challenges work, is that we see that there's an opportunity that we might get something good at, we might succeed somehow, or that we'll grow from the experience, and also that we've got strategies that we can use to cope. So, people were saying this, well, there's a 15% chance I might get it. And also they had a strategy because everyone can persist with a problem. So have a think. I wonder what you think, maybe what the difference was in performance here. This blew my mind when I seen it. The scores in the group where the problem was framed as a challenge were 47% better with a really difficult maths exam, which blew my mind. So how we frame our problems really really affects how we apply ourselves to them, and that really impacts our results. So how might you do this practically yourself? Well, one way to switch from a threat to a challenge mindset is in terms of how you're thinking about the goals you're setting. So often when we're faced with problems, we'll set what are called avoidant goals. So these are goals around, I don't want to fail, or I want to stop, or I want to avoid being stressed. So we're setting goals around what it is we don't want to do. And the problem with this is that it can really impact your confidence and your motivation. So avoidant goals are unachievable. So for example, if you set yourself the goal, I don't want to fail or I don't want to be stressed, well, at some point you're probably going to fail at something, or at some point you're probably going to get a bit stressed. And because you can't succeed at it, or because at some point you're going to fail, that can really impact your confidence. And if you don't feel confident in terms of your ability to do something, that tends to impact your motivation. So, like, why would you put in all the effort if you think you're going to fail anyway? So, a quick flip around that is to set goals around what it is that you want. So, for example, what do you want to achieve, or what do you want to learn out of a situation? And when we set goals like around what it is that we want, we'll tend to have much better results. So I'll give you an example. So rather than telling yourself, what, I want to be less stressed, or I don't want to be stressed, if you set yourself a goal around, I want to exercise more, or I want to meditate more, or I want to finish work every day at 6 p.m. and get enough downtime, what you can do with that is you can kind of start to create a sense of progress. So, for example, even if you say, I want to finish work every day at 6 p.m. and you only get to finish work 3 days this week at 6 p.m., but you've made progress because 3 out of 5 is better than none. And this in turn helps create confidence. It's like, well, I've managed to do this a little bit. I'm getting better at it. And that, as a return, when you start to see a little bit of success, that really helps with your motivation. So have a think about that, like, around your stress. What kind of goals might you set that help you take advantage of some of those positive stress hormones as well? Uh, what are the kind of things that I would like to achieve? How might I break the problem down? How might I enjoy this? How might I get like a rush from some stress or some of my problems? Or how can I connect to other people or help other people in a similar situation? How can I take the focus off myself? Or how can I learn to deal with my stress better? Okay, conscious of time, so I'll be very quick with this last bit. The other aspect of our problems is sometimes we have to deal with overwhelm. We've got just too many things and too many problems on our plate. 3 strategies in terms of that that are very useful. First of all, you need a system in place in order to organize all your ideas and projects and problems. The one I use is called Getting Things Done by David Allen. Again, if you Google that book, or I can share it in some resources I'll send to you guys later. It's a really good, simple system in terms of organizing your day to day. And it's got things like a projects list, which is just a bullet point list of everything you've got going on one page. You need to have a calendar. You need to have what's called a weekly review, where you're looking at everything once a week. So you can kind of stay on top of everything and not be getting so stressed out. The second strategy can be very useful is what's called a stress list. So I'll often sit down with people and I will get them to make a list of absolutely everything that's stressing them out. And then we'll go through and we'll ask, well, okay, what can you delegate? What can you let go of? What are the priorities? And what might be some quick wins that we can get some things off that list very, very quickly? Even just taking the time to sit down and look at everything rather than feeling overwhelmed, but it can be very useful. And finally, the to-don't list is a strategy I really like as well. So the to-don't list is where you write down everything that's stressing you out. Then you pick your 3 priorities and everything else goes in the to-don't list. And we just forget about it until we deal with some of the priorities. And so you can't move anything from your to-don't list onto your to-do list until you deal with something on your 3 priorities even. Sorry. So that's kind of pretty much it around the different strategies. So we think about stress in a couple of different ways. One, it's physiological. So it's really important to have some form of deep relaxation and to have some form of exercise routine if you're chronically stressed. The second is stress is psychological and emotional. So we need strategies to be able to reframe our problems and how we're thinking about them, and also coping strategies in terms of how we feel. And finally, stress is also very much associated with our problems. So have a think about, are you setting avoidant goals or approach goals? And what strategies we got in place in order to deal with overwhelm. I'll finish up. I just wanted to talk very quickly about a 90-day address to stress program that I have for leaders and professionals. This is all about reducing the impact that stress has on your work performance, reducing the impact that stress has on your relationships, and very importantly, on your health. I usually start with a free initial consult, so I do half an hour with people to see if it's the most appropriate solution for them. We'll do some assessment and measurement early, and then it's all about putting those self-care strategies in place and maybe getting some behavior change. It's those psychological strategies, and I'd use a lot of cognitive behavioral techniques with that. And also, I suppose we can do all the self-care and all the reframing the world if we're not dealing with some of the things that are stressing us out. And so we bring in some problem-solving strategies as well in order to remove some of those stressors. If you'd like a chat about that, again, you can scan the QR code on the screen. I know Kieran's put some links in the chat as well. And that testimonial is from someone that we worked on a little bit recently. I won't read it out. I'll let you have a look at it. It's there, and I'm conscious we're very short on time, so I might hand back over to Kieran in terms of the wrap up, or if there's any questions. There was one in the chat, Kieran, but how are we
Yeah,
doing
that's
on
right,
time?
Jason. Thanks very much for a fantastic session there. Yeah, the one question we've got so far is how do you differentiate between chronic stress symptoms listed here and anxiety?
There is a really good measurement called the DASS, and that measures depression, anxiety, and stress. You can give it a Google. Whoever asked that question, feel free if you reach out to me in privately, and I can share a link with you, and I can bring you through it. Stress and anxiety are very linked. So like when you're chronically stressed over time, it can kind of lead to chronic anxiety, but the symptoms are slightly different. And in terms of how you approach it, I suppose stress is often the precursor to something like chronic anxiety, you know. Um, if there is a major difference, I suppose sometimes it might be down to your functioning, you know. If you're finding it difficult to maybe go out in public or, you know, deal with things in your day to day, that can often be a sign that maybe anxiety is raising its head a little bit more. So, stress is often, when we're chronically stressed anyway, sometimes it can be very high functioning until we kind of hit that burnout point where we tend to go the other direction and tend to just try to get away from everything, you know. I hope that makes sense. But I think my message there is reach out to me and we have an assessment and it's going to help you make the best decision around that, if you like.
That's great, Jason. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're going to send through all the helpful links, along with posting the recording of this webinar later today. And as Jason mentioned there, if you have a question, book the complimentary chat, 30-minute catch up, and you can chat with Jason then. Just before we finish up, just want to highlight some upcoming webinars that we have. Our next webinar will be on February 27th, and that's how to build a sustainable personal brand with Mary Fleming. And as well as our upcoming Second Tuesday events as part of DLR West Business Association. Our next event is on March 10th, and that's all about sustainable business practices. This is with Gavin Hart. So if you scan that QR code or you go to dlrwba.ie or Bridge Enterprise Centres website as well, you can register for those events. I just want to say, Jason, thank you very much for a very insightful session. And yeah, have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much, Kieran. Cheers.